Hello, my name is Euro and welcome to another Baldur's Gate 3 build video. In today's video I'll be showing you my take on the Shadowblade Warlock build, which in our case will be a multi-class of a fighter, warlock and a rogue. It will focus around fighting from the spell Darkness, also being able to cast Eldritch Blast, dealing relatively consistent critical damage, and also dealing high psychic damage with our weapons. So let's get into the character creation. For our character we're going with the Drow Elf. Now, good alternatives for this race are the Deep Gnomes and the Lightfoot Halflings, because they can give you advantage on stealth, so you can be more rogue-like Warlock, or rogue-like Warlock. You can also take something like the Half-Orc, which has the Brutal Critical, which I believe adds another damage die when you crit, which is going to happen quite often. Or, as always, you can pick any race that you may prefer. It's not a deal breaker if you don't pick one of these four races. Now, for our Drow Elf, we are getting our Dancing Lights as a racial cantrip at level 1. This will be useful potentially in the Act 2, and after that we're basically going to be ignoring it because we're going to be focusing around casting Darkness and concentrating on it instead of casting any sorts of light. For our other racial features, we gain Drow Weapon Training. This won't matter for us too much because we will eventually respec and play as a fighter primarily, so we will get all of our... Not primarily, but we'll get a class, a level of a fighter, so that we have all proficiencies, weapon and armor-wise. We also get Superior Dark Vision, which is nice, but since we are going to be a Shadowblade Warlock, we will get Devil's Sight, which is an upgraded version of the Superior Dark Vision. But until we get to the Devil's Sight, this is useful. And then lastly, we get the Fey Ancestry. We have advantage on being charmed, against being charmed, and we can't be put to sleep by magic, which is also useful. For a sub-race, I'm going with the Loldsworn Drow. You can go with the Seldarin Drow as well. There isn't too much of a difference, mainly it's just flavor text and dialogue choices, and that is about it. Now, for our class, there's two choices, so there's difference. Let's go to ability scores first. So, for the first 7 levels, you will want to play as a primarily a Warlock. And the Warlock you're going to go with is going to be the Great Old One. And then for the spells that I like to take usually in the beginning of parts of the game, I take Hex and Armor of Agathis. You can later switch these off as you level up. And then for your first 7 level ability scores, you'll want to go with 17 Charisma. So for spell casting, your primary source of damage in the beginning will be like Eldritch Blast and so on. You want 16 Dexterity for the armor class. You then want 14 Constitution and 10 Wisdom. This will be your ability scores until you reach level 7. Alright? After you reach level 7, so for the first 7 levels, you'll be a pure Shadowblade or pure Pact of the Blade Warlock. After you reach level 7, you will multi-class and respec into Fighter. Reason we're going Fighter is, for the first 5 levels, we're going to go Fighter. We're going to get our Fighter extra attack, which works with all weapons. For example, an issue I ran into with the Pact of the Blade weapon is if, let's say, you want to shoot an arrow of darkness into enemies, you will lose your extra attack from the Pact weapon. Because with the Pact weapon, for the extra attack to work, you need to attack with the Pact weapon. So, since we're going fighter anyway, in this build, we're gonna go actually, when we respec, first 5 levels as a fighter, and then we're gonna add 2 levels of Warlock at the end. This is why respecing at level 7 is important, so you can get your Devil's Sight. So, this video will now continue on as if we are level 7 and we have respect. So we're going fighter. With a fighter, you gain a second wind, which gives us a 1d10 plus our fighter level heal. For a bonus action, 1 per short rest. And for our fighter fighting style, we're going to go with the 2-weapon fighting. This makes it so when we make an attack with our offhand weapon, we add our ability modifier to the damage of the attack, meaning if we, let's say, attack with a short sword in our offhand, it would normally deal 1d6 damage. With this fighting style, it's going to add our ability modifier to it, so dexterity. Now for the ability scores, after we respec, because when we were a Warlock, our ability scores were 17, 16, 14, 10. So once we respec, all you gotta do is just switch these two out. So you put a +2 into dexterity, so you have 17 dexterity, and you +1 into charisma, so you have 16 charisma. Because from this point on, dexterity will be our main weapon ability modifier. Why this is important is your main hand would benefit from the Pact of the Blade Warlock, like the binding, but offhand and your ranged weapon wouldn't, and those can come in handy. Basically, then the difference in accuracy was gonna end up being it's like around 10 to 15%. With this, the difference in accuracy will be maybe 5%, so this is very important. I did in my original playthrough of trying this build out make a mistake of primarily focusing into charisma, and then I realized, oh, I should have gone into dexterity. So for this video, I'll be showing you the, so to say, the correct path. For the skill proficiencies, this is the default. So I usually just stick with athletics, so helps you resist being shoved and helps you shove, and then plus the proficiency into intimidation. So we have a +5 intimidation. It's not showing my background here, but my background is the guild artisan, therefore I have proficiency in persuasion and insight, which are two very useful ones. The good alternative backgrounds, if you want sleight of hand proficiency and stealth, you can go with the ones that give you either or pick any other background that you may prefer. We will get proficiency in one of these two once we get our rogue multiclass. So we will now move on to the rest of the levels. Alright, so here at level 2, we're continuing as a fighter. So for our level 2 fighter action, we gain the action surge, which gives us a extra action on the turn that we use it. At level 3, we unlock one racial spell, and that is the Fairy Fire. This makes it so all targets within the area turn visible, and attack rolls against them have advantage. That is if they fail the save. This also works on friendlies as well as enemies, so you should be careful while using it. For a subclass, we're going with the Champion. Champion gives us the improved critical hit. The number you need to roll a critical hit while attacking is reduced by 1. This effect can stack, and we will be stacking this effect with a few of our items, because we want to hit critical hits relatively consistently. At level 4, we get our first feat, and that will be ability improvement +2 into dexterity. Now at this point, usually you can at level 4 or level 5 deal with anti-ethel, and you can potentially get another +1 into an ability score. Now since you will be playing as a warlock for the first 7 levels, you might consider taking it into charisma, but I would argue against it. I would say either save, pick the dexterity boon, and then save it until you respec, or just consume it and you will have 17 into dexterity, and then when you respec and add +2, you will have then a 20. Moving on to level 5, we gain our extra attack and we gain our racial spell, Darkness. So this will give us 1 free additional cast of Darkness once per short rest, which is pretty useful. At level 6, we're going to start our multiclass and we're going to take Warlock. For our Warlock cantrips, we're going to go with Eldritch Blast and the Friends. These are the two cantrips you would take when you're playing initially for those first 7 levels as a Warlock anyway. Eldritch Blast being one of the better damaging cantrips, and Friends being a really good cantrip that you use outside of combat. You get advantage on a charisma check against a non-hostile creature. Just make sure that when you cast this on somebody and you stop talking to them, leave the area, stop concentrating on the spell, and then come back, because if the timer runs out while you're in the area and they spot you, they will accuse you of enchanting them and you will have trouble with the law. For a subclass, we're going with the Great Old One. Great Old One gives you the Mortal Reminder, which when you land a critical hit against the creature and any nearby enemies must succeed a wisdom saving throw or become frightened until the end of their next turn. This is very useful because if, let's say, there's like 3 enemies around you, you have darkness casted on them, and if you critically strike them and they fail the save, they will then be forced to stay inside of the darkness, giving you advantage against them, and they will of course have disadvantage against you because of darkness and also because they're frightened. So this is a very good feature that synergizes with our darkness spell. For the 2 spells I would suggest you take here is Hex and Protection from Evil and Good. Normally you would take Hex and Armor Agathis, and then you would switch out Hex for something else later. But since we will be picking mostly concentrating spells, because we have one of our rings that will synergize with concentrating spells quite a bit, Hex will be useful even in the late game, because you will deal 1d6 necrotic damage with 4 attacks with your weapon potentially, which is going to be a quite nice damage boost. And also Protection from Evil and Good is good because it gives you, basically makes you can't be charmed or frightened or possessed, and the creatures have disadvantage when they attack you, and these creatures are aberrations, celestials, elementals, fae, fiends, and undead, and there are quite a few aberrations, fiends and undead and elementals in the game, so this is a useful spell throughout the game. At level 7, we are getting our level 2 Warlock, and here, of the spells you can pick up here, it doesn't really matter, because we'll be switching it out on level 8. So I'll just take the Dissonant Whispers for now, and then for our Eldritch Invocations, for the first one you can take either Agonizing Blast, which adds your Charisma modifier to damage dealt, or the Repelling Blast, which makes you push creatures away for 4.5 meters. And then for the second one, you will take, of course, the very important Devil's Sight. You can see normally in the darkness, both magical and non-magical, up to a distance of 24 meters. This is where it's going to make it so that enemies are going to be blinded by our darkness, while we are not going to be blinded by it. At level 8, we get our third and last level of Warlock, and for the spells, we're of course taking Darkness Spell, and for our Pact Boon, we're going with the Pacted Blade, and then for our replacing spells, we're going to replace Dissonant Whispers for Misty Step. Misty Step is just too good to pass on. You do have limited Warlock spell slots, but being able to cast Misty Step for one of them can become quite handy, especially if you end up getting surrounded by enemies that are actually capable of seeing in darkness, or if you want to just position yourself next to enemies and then pull up in darkness on them. Misty Step is just amazing for that. At level 9, now here you can either start your rogue multiclass, or what I would suggest you to do is go back to your fighter and get your second and last feat. And the second feat we'll take will be Alert. This makes it so we can't be surprised, and we are pretty much guaranteed to be always first in the initiative, so that we can always set up our darkness and start fighting from it. Now this build does only have 2 feats, but you don't really need more than that, because we will have everything we need pretty much with those 2 feats. And now at level 10, we're going to start our multi-class into a third class, which will be the Rogue. Reason being, we will get, of course, the sneak attack. This is going to additionally increase our damage a little bit. We will only get it to a 2d6 instead of a more, so this is still good, because this will be a 1d6 bonus psychic damage from our weapon. Then for the skill proficiencies, here you have a choice, since you can put 2 points. Well, 1 point in proficiency and then 2 points in expertise, so 3 points. You have quite a few choices here. So if you do not have a rogue who's a lockpick in your class, in your party, I would suggest going with proficiency and expertise into sleight of hand. If you do have it, then you can go something like this. This is so that you're basically immune to being, not basically, but close to being immune to being shoved. Or if you want more dialogue skills, you can also put into one of these 4, or you can also get some perception or insight. This is up to you. In my playthrough, I believe I went sleight of hand because I didn't have a rogue in my party, and then I sticked 1 into acrobatics. So I'll be going with that here. Moving to level 11, we gain our cunning actions, hide, dash, and disengage, which are very nice. And then lastly, at level 12, we get our subclass, which of course we're going with a thief. This is going to give us fast hands to gain additional bonus action. This is what is going to allow us to have 4 weapon attacks in a single turn. Of course, then that's where we get that 4d6 necrotic damage if we have Hex casted on an enemy. We also get second story work. You master the art of falling and gain resistance to falling damage. This is okay, not too useful, but if you jump from high distance, this is okay. And now we will go to the equipment section. Alright, so here we are in the equipment section. So let's start with our headgear. Or actually, let's start with our weapons, because the weapons are gonna be you can do something cheesy or exploitive to get a permanent Shadowblade. So if you look here, we're using the Shadowblade. You have pure psychic damage on the weapon. You have advantage on attack rolls against slightly or heavily obscured targets while using this blade. Now it is a 2d8 plus 6 from our charisma right now. As I mentioned before, I did mess up and I went pure charisma with this character. What you would have is you would have 16 charisma in your case and 22 in dexterity. So then your offhand and your ranged weapons are also on par with your main hand weapon. But the way you can get a permanent Shadowblade that you do not need to concentrate on is you need the Shadowblade ring. Then you hire a hireling, you give them this ring, have them summon the weapon, and then when they have their weapon summoned and it's in their hand, you send them back to the fugue plane. You dismiss them. And then you go to the Withers again and hire that same hireling. And then when they come back, they will have the Shadowblade in their weapon slot. Basically, they will get the permanent Shadowblade on them. You can get a lot of these Shadowblades if you want. I usually don't like to go crazy and then I just summon one. But you can summon two and then just have two Shadowblades in your hands. That's another thing you can do. But for the offhand weapon, I like to use the Render of Mind and Body. When the wielder attacks with advantage, they deal additional 1d8 psychic damage. So this weapon will basically always deal 1d8 psychic damage because we're going to be blinding our enemies pretty much non-stop. For the alternatives, before you get the Shadowblade, you can use the Hunter's Dagger. On a hit, a target must succeed a DC 13 Constitution saving throw or become ruptured. Ruptured means that they take 1d4 piercing damage when they move, which is pretty good. And then for the other alternative, you can take the Slicing Short Sword. When the wielder attacks with advantage, they inflict bleeding. You can combo these two weapons, and then when you attack somebody while inside darkness, they will take psychic damage and also they will start bleeding. And if you have Bual's Benediction, your allies will gain advantage against them once they leave your darkness. But let's continue on then, I guess, with our weapons, and we'll go back to armors in a bit. So for the ranged weapon, I'm going with the Deadshot. This gives us the improved critical hit. The number you need to roll a critical hit while attacking is reduced by 1. This effect can stack, so it stacks with our subclass, so now we crit at a 18. We also gain Keen Attack. The wielder doubles their proficiency bonus when rolling ranged attacks with this weapon unless they have disadvantage, so essentially it has ridiculously high accuracy. For the alternatives, you can go with the Hunting Shortbow. This gives you advantage against monstrosity type enemies and gives you Hunter's Mark once per long rest. Or the Gandril's Aspiration, as well, advantage against monstrosity type enemies, and it has the special weapon action, which is the Sacred Munitions. For one turn, you can make it so your ranged attacks possibly inflict turn undead onto undead targets. You can also take the Least Expected. While obscured in shadow, the wielder has 1d4 bonus to the ranged attacks, and you also have the Blinding Shot weapon action. Or you can also go with the Dark Fire Shortbow, which gives you resistances to fire and cold damage and gives you 1 haste per long rest. And I should mention here, while we're at the weapon section, very important piece of equipment will be the Arrows of Darkness, which spread magical darkness on impact for 3 turns. So you can, if you're out of spell slots, you can use a weapon action to inflict darkness in a much smaller radius. But now, going back to our armors, we have the Covert Cowl. While obscured, the number you need to roll a critical hit while attacking is reduced by 1. So with the Covert Cowl, while we're obscured, we crit on a 17. For the alternative, you can take the Dark Justiciar Helmet, which has the same effect of the Covert Critical, but also has the magical durability. The wielder has a +1 bonus to saving throws against spells. It's a decent effect, and then Covert Cowl gives you Dexterity saving throws +1, while the Justiciar Helmet gives you Constitution saving throws +1. For our cloak, we're going with the Cloak of Displacement. At the beginning of the wearer's turn, the cloak activates, granting enemies disadvantage on attack rolls that target the wearer. This effect lasts until the wearer takes damage. This is useful outside of darkness, let's say, or if enemies are immune to being blinded by darkness, this cloak is useful. Or you can alternatively take the Cloak of Cunning Broom. When the wearer disengages, they also create a full cloud with 2 radius lasts for 1 turn. You should note though, this creates a fog cloud, not a darkness cloud, so you will be blinded by it, so you need to exit out of it to gain advantage against enemies. You can also take something like the Cloak of Protection or no cloaks at all. It's not too much of a big deal. For the armor, we're going with the Dark Justiciar Halfplate. This gives us Shar Umbra. While obscured, the wearer has advantage on stealth checks. This can come in handy, but we won't be using stealth too much. But what is very handy is the advantage on Constitution saving throw checks. This essentially armor has built-in Warcaster, which is absolutely amazing. This is going to save you a lot of spell slots because you will not be breaking your concentration too often. This also gives us once per long rest Shara's Aegis, which is basically just Shield of Faith that gives you +2 armor class while you're concentrating on this spell. So you have a backup spell if you run out of spell slots. For the alternative, you can take the Spiral Silk Armor. This gives you a +1 to stealth checks and advantage on Constitution saving throw checks. As well, built-in Warcaster. For our gloves, we're going with the Brain Drain Gloves. When you deal psychic damage, you also inflict Mental Fatigue for 2 turns. Mental Fatigue affected entity has a -1 penalty to Wisdom, Intelligence, and Charisma saving throws for every turn remaining. Meaning, if they have, let's say, 4 Mental Fatigue, they have a -4 penalty to these 3 saving throws, which is quite nasty. When the creature fails a Wisdom, Intelligence, or Charisma saving throw, while having 5 or more turns of this condition, they take 1d4 psychic damage and is no longer mentally fatigued. Now, these gloves for ourselves won't really work because we don't really have any spells that require those saving throws, but they synergize amazingly well if you have, let's say, Vengeance Paladins or any other class that can cast, let's say, Fear, Confusion, Hold Person, Hold Monster. They have great synergy with those. But if you do not care about this condition, then you can just take the Dark Justiciar Gauntlets, which give you a flat 1d4 bonus necrotic damage with your weapon attacks, further increasing your weapon damage, which is also quite good. For the boots, you can go with the Boots of Striding. When you cast a spell that requires concentration, you gain momentum for 1 turn. This is useful if you cast that spell during combat, but outside of combat it won't work too much. But what will be very useful during combat is, while you're concentrating, you can't get knocked prone or be moved against your will. So these boots essentially anchor you down when you're concentrating on a spell, preventing enemies from knocking you prone or moving you, which is very good. For the alternatives, you can take the Disintegrating Nightwalkers. You can't be enwebbed, entangled, or ensnared, and can sleep on Greaser Ice, and you gain Misty Step once per short rest, so 3 Misty Steps per long rest. For our amulet, we're going with the Surgeon's Subjugation Amulet. Once per long rest, while scoring a critical hit on a humanoid, the wearer can paralyze the target for 2 turns. This is very useful because we will be hitting critical hits relatively consistently, because we crit on a 17 with our equipment, and then if we drink Elixir of Viciousness, we then crit on a 16, which is very handy. For our rings, we're going with the Shadow Cloaked Ring. The wearer's weapon and unarmed attacks deal additional 1d4 damage against slightly or heavily obscured creatures and creatures made of shadow, so basically like 99% of the time. For our second ring, we're going with the Strange Conduit Ring. While concentrating on a spell, the wearer's weapon attacks deal additional 1d4 psychic damage, so basically as well like 99% of the time, because we'll be concentrating pretty much non-stop. Now, I do have the Shadowblade ring here. This I would use instead of the Shadowcloak ring, or instead of either or. If, let's say, they fix the permanent Shadowblade, then I would switch one of these 2 rings for the Shadowblade. And then if they break your concentration, I would use for the Slicing Short Sword instead of the Shadowblade, and then you can just swap out the ring, right? But as long as this trick works, and you can have a permanent Shadowblade, I would have these 2 rings, and this one would be just in the inventory in case you need to summon it again if the trick is fixed. So that is it for the equipment section. Actually, never mind, I lied. We have one more item. Very important item, actually. The Resonance Stone. All nearby creatures are steeped in bliss. This makes it so, steeped in bliss, basically entity has advantage on physical checks and disadvantage on mental saving throws, and they're vulnerable to psychic damage. So what this is going to do, basically when anybody stands next to us and while they're steeped in bliss, they will take double damage from our psychic damage. And the Shadowblade ring is going to just deal ridiculous, not ring, just the Shadowblade is going to deal ridiculous psychic damage. This one will deal decent psychic damage as well, so it's going to be a 2d8 plus 2d4, but yeah, this is where the ridiculous damage will come from. Though I should note that you kind of want to get rid of this if you're fighting Mind Flayers, because they will absolutely mess you up, because you will gain disadvantage on mental saving throws, which they have quite a lot of, and they also deal primarily psychic damage. But now we are done with the equipment section, so I will now see you in the battle showcase. Alright, so here we are yet again at the Flaming Fists Barracks for yet another battle showcase. Now before we start, I should mention, because I forgot to do it earlier, is if you follow the video and you end up with primarily focusing in your dexterity, you should have around 20 to 22 dexterity depending on which boons you took. Now, I repeat again, because I messed up in this playthrough and I focused into Charisma, I have Auntie's boon and the Mirror of Loss boon into Charisma. This should not be here, so I should have 16 Charisma and I should have 22 Dexterity. Now, I did use mods to get my Dexterity to the appropriate number, so let's just pretend I have the Auntie boon and the Mirror of Loss boon here, and I have 22 Dexterity, while they are not in Charisma, and I have 16 Charisma. Because of this, we do not want to bind our Shadowblade as a packed weapon, because what's going to end up happening is it's going to end up from a 2d8 plus 6, it's going to turn into a 2d8 plus 3, and we're going to have accuracy instead of 85, we're going to have 70% accuracy. So what you can safely do with these 2 abilities here, or a class action, you can just get rid of them. You don't need them. So now let's get into the usual combat showcase. Now, because I did forget to drink Elixir of Viciousness beforehand, I'm just going to do it now. I'll waste my bonus action. It should be still fine. We are now going to use a darkness spell to get darkness all over this group of enemies here. Normally, if you wanted to, let's say, focus on somebody who is singled out like this fist clover here, you could shoot an arrow of darkness at her and then rush her to start shanking her from the dark. But we're going to cast darkness here on this group of enemies here. And then we're going to use our action surge to get our action back. And let's take a look at the damage. Hopefully we will get a crit now, and let's see if we can one-shot any of them. So we didn't get a crit, unfortunately, but we dealt 56 damage to him because of the vulnerability to psychic damage. So we got 11 from the weapon, 6 from dexterity, 2 from psychic, shadow thief, the ring, and 1 from strage conduit, the ring. So rounded up to 20 plus 20 because of vulnerable. And then our sneak attack, we rolled 8, so plus 8 because of vulnerable, so we dealt a 16. So 56 damage, he's almost dead. So let's see if we can finish him off with our offhand weapon, and let's look at the offhand damage. We did get a crit with our offhand, and if you look here, both of these fists failed the save, and they're both frightened, so now they're basically stuck for one more turn in the darkness, giving us advantage against them. If we look at the damage, we dealt 15 piercing damage. So we dealt 2d6 because it was a crit, so it's double. It's actually a 1d6, so we rolled minimum damage on the roll itself, but we got an 8 altogether because of the dexterity modifier and the weapon enchantment, and we rolled a 3 on the Shadowblade, so it ended up being 15 because it was a crit. So basically, if it crits, all of the dice double up, and it just shows the roll you got from the double dice. And then we dealt 18 psychic damage. We got a 1d8 from the render of mind and body, and then 1d4 from the strange conduit ring. Again, it all doubled up because it was a crit, and of course it doubled again because he was vulnerable to psychic damage. So let's now again hit fist cross here and see if we can one-shot him with the crit. So we did a crit hit. If we had a sneak attack, he would have been killed, but because we don't have a sneak attack, he's almost dead. We can choose to paralyze him if we want to. He would probably do this against boss type humanoids, but if you look here, damage is quite ridiculous, namely because of course we have the resonant stone with us, making everybody vulnerable to psychic damage. Even without it though, the damage is quite significant. If you did decide to get another Shadowblade ring with the trick I mentioned in the equipment section, of course then your damage would be quite ridiculous indeed. But that is it for the battle showcase, that is it for the video. I hope you enjoyed. I would appreciate it if you leave a like and subscribe for more Baldur's Gate 3 content, and I will see you in the next one.